I just wanted to share a little personal experience with you. So when I was working on my undergraduate degree, and this was 20 plus years ago, I was really focused on digital communications, control theory, and my dad, who had worked in the power industry his whole career, called me up one day and said, "Hey, son, you should really think about a career in the power industry. It's really stable, nothing ever changes. Got these big generators, transmission grid, everything is very incremental." And I believed him, and it was enough to get me into the industry. But it's been anything but stable and constant. It's been one of the fastest moving industries I think that we have, which is awesome because it presents a lot of great opportunities. It's brought a lot of great minds out of the woodworks, and I think we're all thinking about how to ensure cheap or affordable, I should say, affordable, reliable, safe electricity in the future. So, I thank you all for your participation and for your presentations today, and look forward to this conversation. So this topic too is very timely. I'm sure you're all aware of the heat dome that is sitting in the western U.S. right now. I've been getting just message after message after message on my phone about the situation in California. I'm happy to report that I think we're through the worst of it. I think the last couple of days were going to be the hottest days, and hopefully from here on out, here in Utah and across the West, we can see a little bit of a break in this heat dome. So I just want to start really quick by talking about what WECC is. You may have heard of WECC in one or two different ways, or NERC. But I want to give you just a brief overview so that you can have a little bit of context in where I'm coming from today. So WECC is one of 6 regional entities that has delegated authority from NERC, and that's through FERC, to assure a reliable and secure bulk power system. And so the footprint for WECC is the entire Western Interconnection, which covers all or part of 14 Western U.S. states, the Canadian provinces of Alberta and British Columbia, and just a little tip of northern New Mexico on the Baja Peninsula. So coincidentally, that's also the same footprint as the Western Interconnection, which is the synchronized grid that we're all part of here in the West. And so as you can see there, we also have our mission statement on the left. And I really appreciate some of the comments that I heard earlier as people talked about the definition of resilience. It seems to be a really hot topic that keeps coming up lately, and I'm not quite sure everybody is on the same page when it comes to understanding exactly what resilience is. And I'm not going to try and further define that for you, but I will say, for the purpose of my presentation today, I'm really focused on specific activities that WECC has engaged in to help prepare for kind of the pre-event type resilience activities. Not so much after a major event has happened, how do we rebuild the system? I'm not going to be talking about that type of activity. It's more the former, where we're looking forward, trying to anticipate what types of events we might experience in the West, and how do we plan for those? And so hopefully I'll be able to share some new concepts with you today. And I really appreciated the Pacific Core presentation, and it really demonstrates the work that the utilities in the West are going to try and address some of these challenges that we face, specifically around wildfires and climate change. So with that, I am going to focus specifically on extreme weather events. And one thing that comes to mind when I think of the impact specifically on the West and how these weather events are changing the way that we plan and operate the system, first thing that comes to my mind is geographical and resource diversity. So for the past however many decades, the West has built an infrastructure based on geographical and resource diversity. So we have planned on different parts of the country experiencing extreme temperatures at different times. So if the Southwest was having a really hot summer, we could always rely on the Northwest to provide power from all of the hydrogeneration that they benefit from. and then vice versa in the winter. So the system, if you look at the Western Interconnection high voltage system, it looks like a big donut, and we're able to move power around as needed. One of the things that climate change does, though, is it really kind of throws a wrench in that whole concept. So specifically in August of 2020, we experienced a west-wide heat event. The heat wave, I think, is what they called it. And that was one of the first times, at least in my experience, when we saw a weather event impacting almost the entire Western US and Canada, where we couldn't really turn and rely on imports from different areas into highly affected areas. People were really trying to hold on to the power that they had because of the load growth that they were experiencing during that heat wave. And it was lasting for an extended period of time, which just kind of really tested our energy limitations of the system. So since that heat wave, we've experienced a lot of other different types of weather events. And I sat back there and I was trying to remember the names of some of these, but we've experienced heat waves, we've experienced heat domes, which we're currently in right now. I think last June, we also experienced what they call the heat dome. We've experienced atmospheric rivers, freezing rain, extreme winter weather, along with that polar vortexes, exceptional droughts. You know, there's different scales of drought. A lot of the West has been at some point in that exceptional drought phase, which is the most extreme. Massive wildfires, earthquakes, floods, different types of windstorms. There's a pretty unique windstorm that Phoenix sometimes experiences called the Haboob, where they get a lot of the sand blowing in and it just wreaks havoc on everything. But this is all within the last 2 years. So these events that we once thought were high impact, low frequency events are starting to hit us more and more frequently. And you know, the question I raised earlier about, well, how do you plan for a future when historically we've experienced these things so infrequently, but now we're starting to experience them more and more? What types of assumptions do you use when you're planning to build the system? So with that being said, I'm going to jump right into the August 2020 heat wave event, because I know, at least for WECC, and I think for a lot of utilities in the West, it really changed the way that we thought about planning and operations of the grid. And so just a few facts about that heat wave event. So as I mentioned, extremely hot conditions throughout the entire West. Here's a map that we pulled out a couple of years ago, so you can see the affected areas, and it is huge. It's most of the West, just like we're experiencing today. This was the first time in a while where we saw firm load shed because of resource deficiencies. So in California on August 14th to 15th of 2020, we saw a couple of times in the late afternoon, and you know, I think we've all heard of the duck curve. Well, this was the duck curve in action. So a lot of heat, sun's starting to go down, so our solar resources are dropping off. We just didn't have enough generation to meet the demand at the time, and so we actually had to shed load on those 2 days. Also interesting to note that on August 18th, so 3 days later, California actually responded very quickly to this heat wave, and they were learning in real time. And so you can see August 14th and 15th were the first 2 days of the heat wave. They learned really quickly, made some adjustments. They were able to put some emergency actions into place. And luckily for the rest of that heat wave, we didn't see any more load shedding. But on August 18th of that year, we did experience the all-time peak demand of 162,000 megawatts for the Western Interconnection. I will say, this is kind of interesting, that 2 days ago, we set another record. That record was 167,530 megawatts. So you can see in 2 years, 2 extreme events, how much our load growth jumped. August 2020 for California was a 1 in 35 year type of weather event. And it's interesting to see that they experienced a heat wave in 2021 as well, but 2 years later, they're experiencing another heat wave that's just as intense. So the point is, these are things we really can't ignore. We can't just dismiss them as high impact, low probability or low frequency events. They are becoming the norm. So how does that impact the way that WECC does its analysis? And I forgot to mention, so the part of WECC that I oversee does a lot of the engineering and analytical work. So we work with a lot of stakeholders from the West to collect data and information about the grid. We build different types of power system models. We build the power flow stability, production cost models that we use and others use to study the grid. And so I just want to share a few things that we've learned and we've adjusted based on our experiences as of recent. The first one is around how we do resource adequacy planning. So for many decades in the West, when we tried to determine if we had enough resources to meet load forecasts, all we had to do was look at the peak hour, our projected peak hour of the year, and let's say it was in August, and we said, all right, the peak demand for August is, say, 150,000 megawatts. Do we have enough resource capacity plus, some buffer, we call it a planning reserve margin, to meet that demand on that peak hour? And if the answer was yes, we could say, well, hey, we're set. We should be good for every other hour of the year. Now what we're experiencing is there are different time periods, and this is largely driven by the changing resource mix, but it's also driven by our changing weather patterns, which then impact our load forecasts. But this is being driven by this need to look at every hour of the year. So we've shifted significantly. We no longer do a deterministic peak hour type assessment. We do that as well, but we also do more of a probabilistic analysis. And here you can see the different distributions that we use. So we use a lot of historical generator availability information to populate our resource availability curves. But we also look at some of these events and the forecast to develop these distributions of load. And you can imagine other things like electrification. We hear a lot about some new policies and things that are driving EV growth in states like California and others. All of these things create a lot of uncertainty when it comes to load growth in the West. And so this is one of the main ways that we've adjusted to these changes on the grid is through this shift to more of a probabilistic planning approach. Another thing that we learned during the August heat wave, and it actually happened before that, was this reliance on imports. So in different states, different utilities were doing resource planning. If there was a resource shortfall, most of the time they could count on imports from neighboring entities, and they could say, all right, well, it looks like during this this 4 or 5 hours of the year we might be resource deficient. However, we've got a lot of pipes coming into our system, and our neighbors will have excess energy. The August 2020 heat wave event kind of woke us up to that fact that if they're experiencing the same type of extreme weather event that you're facing, that power may not be there. And so another element of the work that we do really evaluates the sensitivities around import limitations. And I won't go into these in much detail, but I will say too, another driver behind this, and we talked a little bit about this at lunch, is just variability, just the amount of uncertainty in the future. When we look out 10, 20 years, because of the changing resource mix, because of these weather events, we've just introduced a huge amount of variability into the system. And so, as a utility or as a decision maker, you have to take a look at the risk that you're facing and determine, all right, how do we want to try and mitigate some of that variability? And so, as you look at some of the movements in the next several years, you'll probably start to see that's one of the things that this industry is trying to do, is limit the amount of variability, which limits the amount of risk of unserved energy on this system. And so just wanted to throw that out there. And this really is the results of one of our studies. We produce a report called the Western Assessment of Resource Adequacy that looks at different subregions within the West and tries to identify hours where they might be resource deficient. And so this is that sensitivity that I was talking about, looking at the effects of import capabilities on their ability to serve load every hour of every year. And this is just a chunk of that looked at the next couple of years. But interesting to see that even, and this was a 2021 analysis, even in 2022, we identified several hours where there was a possibility of unserved energy. And I think we're kind of experiencing that this week. Switching gears just a little bit, another one of the extreme weather situations that we're dealing with currently in the West is the drought. So we have the drought monitor there on the right. It actually looks a lot better than it has over the last several months. This is the most recent one. I just pulled this off the internet a few days ago. I'm looking at September 1st. As you can see, that dark red in Utah, that is the exceptional drought category. That spot was quite a bit bigger a few months ago, and you could see across the West that exceptional drought chunk was even bigger. So this is encouraging to see something like this. However, when you look at the levels of some of the reservoirs we have in the West, and I've pulled out Hoover and Glen Canyon dams just as an example to illustrate this concept, even though it almost looks like the drought situation is getting better, and we have gotten a lot of rain and there's been quite a bit of flooding here in the last month or so, we're still struggling from a reservoir perspective. So just for illustrative purposes, I put the current level of the reservoir, and this is from sea level, compared to the minimum power pool elevation, which the minimum power pool elevation is that level where you can no longer produce electricity because the water has just gotten so low. It's a little bit different than dead pool. I think that might be a term that you've heard about, but similar concept. And so you can see for both of those hydroelectric facilities, we're getting dangerously close to that point where we can no longer rely on those resources. And I also put the nameplate capacity of each of those on there. Like I said, if our peak demand is around 160,000 megawatts, and we have over 3,000 megawatts just coming from those two resources, that's a pretty significant amount of power. Not to mention that we rely on these two resources to also provide other essential reliability services, such as voltage support, flexibility, frequency response, so on and so forth. So definitely something that we at WECC are going to be keeping our eyes on. We did a little bit of a sensitivity analysis around this situation a few months ago, and the three charts illustrate three different scenarios. So the one on the far left is just our base case analysis for 2022. The one in the middle is we cranked up the loads a bit. So probably experiencing something similar to what we saw this week, where we had high demand across the West. And then the one on the right is, well, let's see what happens if we take that high demand scenario and then take Hoover and Glen Canyon Dam out of the picture. What does that do to the flows in the West? And so that's what the different colors represent, are the direction of power flows. And so you can see we've relied on a fairly predictable pattern of power flows across the West. And this is a production cost model. I should have thrown that disclaimer out there. This is the best that we can do with the tools we have to predict how generation would be dispatched. But you can see that just losing these resources in a high demand scenario significantly changes the flows around the West, which in itself can bring interesting challenges and can potentially change the way that we think about how we plan and operate the system going forward. So we heard a lot about wildfire threats, and I just include this because this is a significant and fairly unique threat to the West. I work a lot with different entities around the rest of the country, and they don't worry about wildfires quite like we do out here. But it is getting to a point where it's becoming a fairly significant risk to the bulk power system in terms of affecting transmission lines by either power line caused wildfires, or like we were talking about earlier, utilities are taking proactive actions now to limit the impacts of transmission or distribution lines on wildfires. And so they're initiating different schemes to try and reduce that threat. And so it does bring interesting challenges in how we plan and operate the system. Now, I will say, if you take these three different scenarios, extreme weather, couple that with wildfire threats and loss of hydroelectric generation due to exceptional droughts, then you create kind of an interesting and kind of a scary scenario to look at, but one that's very real. These things tend to kind of happen together. So a tool that we've developed, and this is on our public-facing website, is a wildfire tracking dashboard. And so we've taken public information, both from the fire sector as well as information that we got through, I believe it was EIA, to populate this dashboard. And it tracks active wildfires in the U.S., as well as we'll let you know if there are transmission lines in the area that may potentially be affected by those wildfires. So from a situation awareness perspective, this is a tool that we use to kind of monitor the wildfire situation in the West. We are also collecting wildfire information from utilities to see if there are any trends or observations that we can pull from that information to try and predict where there are high likelihoods of wildfires impacting the transmission system. And then I'll just throw this up there too. So like I said earlier, one of the challenges that the new system and the new situation with the changing weather patterns introduces is that variability. And so to try and address that, we've been doing what we call scenario-based studies. So looking at the bookends, okay, what are I won't call them worst case scenarios, what are possibilities and how does that impact the reliability of the bulk power system? So here are a few of the studies that we completed in 2021 that we've published in 2022. So I just leave that there for you if you'd like to go evaluate some of those studies. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions that you have.
Thank you so much, Branden, for the presentation. And yeah, we have the first question.
The time levels were quite interesting. Has there been a discussion of pumped hydro for increasing the levels? I mean, it looks like there's a lot of solar in that area. So it would be an ideal connection between storing energy situation.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of hypotheticals. I've heard, let's build a pipeline from the ocean, build a desalination plant and pump water into those reservoirs. And, it sounds kind of interesting, and so it sounds almost science fiction-y, but I mean, it's definitely an option that's on the table. As for pumped hydro type options for this particular situation, I mean, part of the challenge that we face is, I mean, for years and years and years, there hasn't been any water that's actually made it to the Pacific Ocean from the Colorado River. And so it's hard to pump that back up when it's just not available. Especially if these reservoirs reach that dead pool level, there will be no output from the reservoirs. So essentially the rivers would dry up downstream. But there are a lot of, and this isn't just a power problem. I mean, this is a water issue. And so I've seen a lot of really creative solutions to some of the problems, and hopefully we'll get to a solution.
Great, thank you. Any other question? Oh.
Thank you for the presentation. Just touch on sort of WECC's relationship and role in ensuring enough generation capacity for interconnect. Are you working a lot with different utilities, different SOs in regard to that, or are you more removed? Just with the figures are so striking with like.
Sure. So WECC's role is kind of unique. The part of WECC that I didn't touch on is we have the delegated authority to develop reliability standards and monitor those and enforce those. And so that's a part of WECC that it's not my part of the company, but that is one of our roles. And part of that function is, we can develop performance requirements, obviously with the help of industry, but we can't force anyone to build. And so a lot of the study work that we do is really informational. It's used to help inform decision makers, be those utilities or commissioners or whatnot, and to help supplement the type of work they do. The value that we provide is we give them that interconnection white picture. So if I'm a utility, say in Idaho, and I'm doing my IRP studies, I'm looking at resource efficiency over the next 10 to 20 years, I can make a lot of assumptions about what's happening outside of my system. Or I can use studies like the WECC study or other studies to really supplement and help draw a wider area picture. Now, they go into a lot more detail in their studies, especially when they're developing IRPs, than we would in this type of analysis. But they do complement each other nicely.